Welcome to Twist of Revenge, where we share quiet stories that echo loudly in the hearts of those who have ever loved, lost, or longed for something more. If you believe that some of life's greatest lessons are hidden in the most ordinary people, then you're in the right place. Go ahead and subscribe not just to this channel, but to the idea that every life, no matter how small it seems, can leave a mark. Today's story is called The Day I Buried My Father. The whole town showed up and I learned he'd been a hidden hero all along. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Day of the Funeral. They say you can know a man by the way people show up for him when he's gone. I always thought my father's funeral would be small, simple. A few old co-workers, maybe the neighbors. A couple of second cousins. The kind of gathering where folding chairs outnumber the guests, and the pastor reads from a page he barely had time to skim. But I was wrong. That morning the sky was gray, not stormy, not tragic, just a quiet, thoughtful gray. The kind of color that hangs in the air when something is about to shift. I stood by the casket expecting echoes. Instead, I heard footsteps. Dozens. Then hundreds. They came from every corner of town, men in worn jackets, women in Sunday dresses, a little boy clutching a hand-drawn picture, a teenager with oil stains on his hands, a woman in a nurse's uniform. They came with flowers, casseroles, and stories, but more than that, they came with tears. One by one, they walked past me and whispered, "He helped me when no one else would." Another said, "He saved my son's life." And still another, voice trembling, "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for your father." I stood frozen, numb, not from grief. I had been grieving since the hospital called me 3 nights ago. This was something else. It was the grief of not knowing the man I thought I knew. Because my father, the man who fixed cars in a half-lit garage with rusted tools, the man who never once took a vacation, the man I once felt ashamed of for not making it big, had lived an entire second life I knew nothing about. A life filled with silent acts of kindness, hidden generosity, and a kind of quiet courage that never asked for applause. At the time, I didn't understand it. I couldn't connect the dots. Why were all these people here? What had he done that I, his own child, didn't know about? It would take the next few days and a long list of strangers who somehow knew my father better than I did to unravel the truth. But it started here, on this gray morning, by a wooden casket, surrounded by a town that, it turns out, had already buried a hero long before I ever saw one in him. Blue Book Chapter 2. The father I thought I knew. Growing up, my father was a man of few words and many tools. He came home every evening with grease on his hands and silence on his lips. He'd wash up with that cracked bar of soap in the downstairs sink, scrub until his knuckles turned pink, and then sit at the kitchen table like he was waiting for something to happen, though nothing ever did. We weren't poor exactly. We had food, a roof, a beat-up Chevy that coughed every winter but always started on the 3rd try. But there was always a thinness to our life, a kind of quiet calculation behind every decision. He never bought name-brand anything. He wore the same brown work boots for a decade, and every Christmas he would hand me a single wrapped box with this awkward smile like he wasn't sure if he'd done it right. When I was younger, I thought it meant he didn't care. He wasn't like other dads. He didn't shout from the stands at my baseball games or teach me how to tie a tie. He didn't give speeches about believing in myself. Mostly he just worked, all the time, 6 days a week. Sometimes 7 if a customer's car wouldn't start on Sunday morning. People said he was dependable, that he was honest, the kind of man who kept his promises, but to me he was just quiet, distant, predictable. A man whose dreams seemed no bigger than the four corners of his garage. I remember once, I must have been 10, asking him why we didn't go on vacation like the Petersons down the street. He didn't answer right away, just looked up from his eggs and said, because the Petersons didn't have to replace the transmission on a '98 Taurus last week. At the time, I rolled my eyes. Now I wonder if he skipped that vacation to help someone else. But back then I didn't see sacrifice. I saw smallness. I wanted more. A bigger house. A dad who wore a suit, who talked about mergers and meetings. A dad who didn't come home smelling like engine oil. In high school, I stopped inviting friends over. I was embarrassed. Embarrassed by the peeling paint on the garage door, the patched-up recliner in the living room, the way my father fell asleep during the evening news with a mug of instant coffee still half full in his hand. When I graduated, I didn't ask him for advice. I didn't even thank him. I took my diploma, shook his hand, and left. He never said much about it. Just smiled that same tired smile like he'd been expecting it all along. We talked, of course, holidays, birthdays, the occasional Sunday phone call. But it was the kind of relationship where you talk around things. You ask about weather, about car trouble. You don't ask how someone's heart is doing. I thought I knew him. I thought I'd seen all there was to see, that he was a simple man who had settled for a simple life. I couldn't have known that behind every missed vacation, every cheap birthday gift, every silent evening at the table was a choice. A deliberate, private, generous choice. I didn't know that he was giving pieces of himself to strangers, quietly, anonymously, while I sat across from him, feeling unloved. And maybe that's what grief does. Maybe it doesn't just break your heart, maybe it peels it open, layer by painful layer, until all the old misunderstandings come spilling out. Because on the day of the funeral, when the strangers came and the stories began, I realized I had buried my father twice. Once when I decided he was ordinary, and again when I laid him in the ground. Blue Book Chapter 3, The First Stranger. The woman was small, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled tight into a bun and a handbag that looked older than I was. She walked slowly with the cautious steps of someone who had learned long ago not to assume the ground would always catch her. I didn't recognize her. She stood near the edge of the tent for a long while, quiet, not crying, just watching, like she was waiting her turn, like this wasn't a funeral but a confession line. Eventually she stepped forward. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you," I replied, offering the polite nod I'd already given 100 times that morning. But she didn't move on. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small envelope and placed it gently in my hand. "I've been carrying this for years," she said. "I never knew where to send it." Before I could say anything, she looked me in the eye, and I'll never forget what she said next. "Your father saved my life." The words hit me like a dropped wrench. She must have seen the confusion in my face because she offered a sad smile and added, "He never told you, did he?" I shook my head. She motioned to a nearby bench. We sat. "It was 21 years ago," she began. "I was newly widowed, alone. I'd just been diagnosed with breast cancer. I had no insurance. My children were living states away. I couldn't afford the treatment. I couldn't even afford the gas to get to the hospital." She paused to take a breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know what to do. One night my old Buick broke down in front of your father's shop. I was crying behind the wheel. I think I'd just given up." I looked at her, trying to picture this moment, my father's garage, her tears, a car that wouldn't start. "He knocked on the window," she said. "Didn't ask questions, just told me to pop the hood. He towed the car and himself, fixed the alternator, changed the oil, replaced the tires. When I asked how much I owed, he said it was taken care of. She smiled now, her eyes wet. But that's not the part that saved me. What saved me was what he did next. He drove me to the hospital, waited for me outside. Then he did it again and again. Every treatment. For 6 months, he never let me pay a cent. I couldn't speak. He brought food sometimes, she added, just left it on my porch. Once there was a card, it said, "You don't owe me anything, just stay strong." She looked down at the envelope in my hand. I wrote him a letter after I finished treatment, but I never had the courage to give it to him. I thought maybe it would embarrass him. He never wanted recognition. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper with careful cursive handwriting. It simply read, "You saw me when no one else did. You made me believe I was worth saving. I hope someday I can pass that gift forward." The silence between us stretched long and full. I didn't know what to say. There was no script for this. No son is prepared to find out that his father was someone else's lifeline. She stood slowly, patted my hand, and turned to leave. But before she did, she said one last thing. "There are more of us, you know, people he helped. You're going to hear a lot of stories today." And just like that, she was gone, swallowed up by the crowd as quietly as she had come. I looked down at the letter again, tracing the curve of each word with my eyes. I thought I knew my father, but I had only scratched the surface. And now the real story was beginning to unfold. Blue Book Chapter 4, A Crowd of Stories. At first, I thought it would end with her, the woman with the letter. I thought she might have been some rare exception, a solitary thread in an otherwise quiet tapestry of my father's life. But then came the next one. A man in his 40s, heavyset with calloused hands and a baseball cap in the same shade of blue as the jumpsuits my father used to wear. He waited politely, hat pressed to his chest, until the service ended and most people had drifted toward the food table. He introduced himself only as Mike. No last name, no small talk. "I worked the night shift at Wilson Steel," he said. "Your dad used to fix my truck, wouldn't take money, just said, 'I know what it's like when your wheels go bad and there's still work to do.'" I nodded, unsure what to say, but Mike wasn't finished. "Then one night I got laid off. Company cut 25 of us. I didn't know what I was gonna do. That same week my daughter got sick. Real sick. I didn't even have gas money to get her to the doctor." He paused, cleared his throat. "I went to your dad's shop, not even for help, just to say I couldn't pay what I owed. He didn't say a word, just reached into that old metal drawer behind the counter and pulled out $60. Told me to fill the tank and if I needed more to come back." He smiled at the memory, but there was grief behind it. "I never came back," he said softly. "But I got my daughter the care she needed, and she's in college now, studying to be a nurse." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "I tried to repay him, sent a card once. He never cashed the check." He placed something on the table beside me, a small wrench, the kind used for adjusting spark plugs. Its handle was wrapped in black tape, worn smooth by time and oil. He gave me this when I said I wanted to learn to fix things myself. Told me, "Start small, fix what you can." And just like that, Mike too was gone. But there was no time to dwell, because behind him was another, and another. A teenage girl who said my father used to tutor her in math every Saturday at the library, free of charge. A single mother who showed me a receipt with my father's handwriting on it, her car repair bill marked, "Paid in full, best of luck." An older man who once broke down on the side of the road, stranded in winter, and was rescued by a stranger in a rusted pickup truck. That stranger, he realized later, was my father. Each story chipped away at the image I had carefully constructed my whole life. each one carved out a piece of truth I had never seen. It was like watching a jigsaw puzzle assemble itself in reverse. The more pieces I gathered, the more I realized how little of the picture I had ever truly understood. He hadn't just helped people. He had made it his life's work, without a foundation, without a non-profit, without a Facebook page full of hashtags and photos. Just one quiet act after another, passed from one hand to the next like folded notes slipped under doors. I stood there for hours, notebook in hand, recording names, stories, faces, not because I needed proof, but because part of me was afraid to forget any of it. As the sun lowered behind the chapel roof and the air turned cooler, a strange thought struck me. My father had died. But for the first time in my life, I was beginning to meet him, and he was so much more than I ever imagined. Blue Book Chapter 5, The Drawer That Never Closed. That night, after the last casserole dish had been claimed and the last condolence had been offered, I drove home in silence. Not to my apartment, but to his house, the one I grew up in. It was the first time I'd been back since before the hospital, since he stopped returning my calls and I chalked it up to age or stubbornness or both. I still had the spare key, the one he hid under the second brick to the left of the porch steps, the same place it had always been. He never changed the hiding spot. He said if someone needed to break in, they probably needed something more than he did. I pushed the door open. The house smelled the same, a mixture of sawdust, black coffee, and motor oil that had sunk into the floors like ghosts that didn't want to leave. The lamp by the window was still plugged in, and the light bulb flickered once before settling into a low glow. I walked through the kitchen. The dishes were stacked neatly. The calendar on the fridge still showed last month. And on the table, still waiting, was a coffee cup with the ring of his thumb pressed into the ceramic, dried, faded, but there. It felt untouched, like he might walk back in at any moment, take off his boots, and ask me if I'd checked the oil in my car. I sat down at the kitchen table. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I opened the drawer beside the sink. Everyone has one, the drawer where the useless things go. Old batteries, bent paper clips, a birthday candle or two, but my father's drawer was different. It wasn't cluttered. It was curated. Inside were a folded newspaper clipping about a local boy who'd gotten into college, a yellowed receipt for brake pads, paid cash no charge, written in pen, a photograph of a young woman in a graduation gown, no name on the back, a small thank you card with a drawing of a house and the words, "We have a home because of you." A Bible bookmarked in the Gospel of Matthew, "Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." I just stared. This was his archive, not of his life, but of theirs, the people he'd helped, the lives he'd touched, quietly without ever asking for anything in return. And below all that, folded neatly in the back of the drawer, was an envelope. My name was on the front, just "To my son." My throat tightened. I didn't open it right away. Some part of me wanted to sit with it, to hold it like a lifeline. Because once I opened it, once I heard his voice through the page, it would mean he was really gone. Instead, I took the envelope and walked down the hall to the garage. His world. Even in death, it smelled like him, rubber, steel, cold concrete, something faintly like pine from that air freshener he kept above the workbench, even though it hadn't smelled like anything in years. The pegboard was still neatly organized. Tools hung like soldiers in formation, everything labeled, everything clean. And in the corner, against the back wall, was something I'd never noticed before, a small wooden chest. Not locked, just sitting there waiting. Inside, rolls of dollar bills rubber-banded. Envelopes marked with first names: Miguel, Carla, J.D., Miss June. A composition notebook filled with names, dates, and what he had given them. Not amounts, not numbers, just phrases like rent covered, bike repair, cash for meds, muffler parts. It wasn't charity. It was love. Tidy, intentional, dignified love. I sat on the floor for a long time, the notebook open in my lap, his envelope still unopened in my hand. Because the question now wasn't just who was my father. It was, how did he live so fully, so generously, without ever telling me? And maybe the harder question, why didn't I ask? Blue Book Chapter 6, the letter he never spoke aloud. I waited until the house was quiet again. Not just empty, quiet, as if even the walls had stopped breathing, as if the air itself was leaning in. I sat on the edge of his old recliner, the same one he used to fall asleep in during football games, his mouth half open, his chest rising and falling like clockwork. I held the envelope between my hands. The paper was soft, worn at the folds. My name was written in block letters, all caps. No dear, no son, just me. That was his way. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, no salutation, no date, just words that felt like they'd been sitting there for years, waiting for me. You used to ask me why I didn't talk more, why I didn't say things like, I'm proud of you, or I love you. I wish I had an easy answer, but the truth is I was raised by a man who never said those things either. He handed me a wrench when I was 10 and told me, fix your own bike. That was his way of saying he believed in me. So I tried to do the same. I showed up. I kept the lights on. I worked late so you wouldn't have to worry about dinner. Maybe that doesn't count for much now, but I hope someday you'll understand that love doesn't always speak loud. Sometimes it just fixes the leaky pipe and never mentions it. I didn't want you to carry my struggles. That's why I never told you about the people I helped. I didn't do it to impress you. I did it because I was one of them once, the man with a broken car and no way to get to work. The kid who didn't eat lunch at school because there wasn't enough at home. I remember what it felt like to be invisible. So I made a promise to myself a long time ago. No one who came to my door would leave feeling that way. You didn't see all this, and that's okay. Maybe I didn't want you to. I wanted you to live bigger, dream further, do more than fix engines and balance carburetors. But if you're reading this, I guess it means I'm gone now. And if I could ask just one thing, it would be this: find someone who needs help and help them quietly, without a receipt, without expecting thanks. That's how you keep me alive. That's how you'll know me now. I didn't cry when he died. I didn't cry when I stood over his casket or when strangers told me stories that unraveled everything I thought I knew. But I cried reading that letter. Not just because of what it said, but because it was the first time I realized he had been talking to me all along, in every oil change, in every packed lunch, in every moment I mistook his silence for indifference. He had said, I love you. I just didn't know the language yet. Blue Book Chapter 7, Names in a Notebook. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of grief, at least not the kind people expect. It was a different weight, like standing at the base of a mountain you never knew existed and realizing it bore your father's name. The notebook sat beside me on the table, closed but humming like it held a pulse. I ran my hand across its weathered cover, just a plain black composition book. No title, no inscription, but inside, a road map. Each page held a name, a date, a quiet deed, nothing boastful, just small lines of ink. April 2, Carla oil change breaks, left groceries at porch. May 19, Mr. Ellis ride to dialysis, sat with him after. August 12, J.D. cash envelope in mailbox, no note. And then there was this. June 5, Miguel job interview, loaned boots, tie, coached answers. No last names, no explanations, just a breadcrumb trail of quiet decency. I turned the pages, tracing the margins where his handwriting got smaller, tighter, like he was trying to fit more good into the same amount of space. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I started with Miguel. It took me 2 hours and 1 phone call to the local food pantry to track him down. He was working at a shipping warehouse on the south edge of town, unloading pallets in the morning heat when I arrived. He looked up, squinting, wiped his brow, and when I introduced myself, "I'm Tom. My father was Roy Halter." His face changed, like a curtain had parted behind his eyes. He dropped the box he was carrying and held out his hand. "Your dad," he said, "was the reason I'm still standing." We sat on the back steps of the warehouse during his break. He pulled out a cigarette but didn't light it, just turned it between his fingers like it helped him think. "I came to town 5 years ago," he said. "Just got out of a halfway house. No car, no place to stay. No one trusted me." He looked down at his hands. "Your dad was the only person who didn't look at me like I was a walking mistake. I went to his shop asking for work. He told me he couldn't pay, but if I wanted to sweep floors, hand him tools, he'd teach me a thing or two." Miguel smiled. Thing or two turned into 6 months. Then one day he tells me I've got an interview at the lumber yard. I told him I didn't have shoes good enough, so he gives me his boots, said they were lucky. Then he takes off his tie, you remember that ugly blue one, and shows me how to knot it. I laughed softly. I did remember it, hideous thing, looked like a water stain on wallpaper. Miguel's voice softened. He waited for me outside that building, asked me how it went. I told him I blew it. He said, "Good, that means you cared." I felt something catch in my throat. "I got the job," Miguel said, "and working ever since. Got my own place now, 2 years sober." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a photo, a little boy, maybe 6 or 7, smiling with 2 front teeth missing. "My son," he said, "named him Roy." I swallowed hard. There were more names, dozens. Each person I visited told a variation of the same story. Your father helped me, when no one else would, when I didn't ask, when I thought I didn't deserve it. He paid water bills, fixed bikes, sat beside hospital beds, delivered casseroles in Tupperware that never came back and never needed to. He didn't save the world, but he saved theirs, and not with speeches, not with big gestures, just with presence, steady, humble, faithful presence. That night I returned home and opened the notebook again, and I realized something. My father hadn't just built a life. He'd built a community, one quiet act at a time. And now, with the weight of that black notebook in my hands, I knew that some part of that legacy had passed to me. Not because I deserved it, but because someone had to carry it forward. Blue Book Chapter 8, The Man Behind the Curtain. I hadn't planned on going back to the funeral home, but the notebook, that black, silent witness of everything my father never said out loud, had been pulling at me, tugging like a loose thread in the sleeve of memory. There was one name in it that stood out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was recent. March 14, Daniel at Bell & Sons, arrangements paid in advance. Do not tell Tom, let him grieve. I recognized the handwriting, of course. It was unmistakable, neat, slightly slanted, and always in blue ink. The date stopped me cold. 3 months before he died. 3 months before the hospital, before the coughing fits he swore were just allergies, before the shortness of breath that turned out to be something no amount of elbow grease could fix. He knew. He knew it was coming, and he planned everything right down to the last detail without ever saying a word. Bell and Sons sat on the corner of Maple and 6th, next to the old church where they still rang bells on Sundays. It was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that makes you speak in a whisper without being told. Daniel was behind the desk, younger than I expected. Early 40s maybe, with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like it had been trained to comfort. He recognized me instantly. "Tom," he said, rising from his chair. "It's good to see you again. I'm so sorry, truly. Your father was one of the good ones." I nodded. "That's actually why I'm here." I pulled the notebook from my coat pocket and opened to the page marked March 14. I turned it around and slid it toward him. Daniel read it slowly, then looked up. "He told me you'd find it eventually." I raised an eyebrow. "So it's true, he paid for his own funeral." Daniel smiled. "Not just paid, planned it. Every flower, every song, every reading. He even picked the time of day, said you weren't much of a morning person." I let out a breath that was half laugh, half ache. Daniel stepped into the back and returned a moment later with a slim manila folder. "He left this in case you came asking." Inside was a letter, another one. This time typed, formal, almost businesslike. "Daniel, please make sure Tom doesn't worry about any of this. He's not good at logistics when he's emotional. Keep it simple, no frills, no fuss. Just make sure there's coffee at the reception. He likes it strong. And one more thing, if anyone asks how I managed to afford all this, just tell them I was lucky. No need to tell them I sold the truck." Roy, my knees went weak. He sold his truck. The same rusted pickup that had been with him longer than I had. The one he patched, repainted, rewired, and loved, not because it was fast or pretty or reliable, but because it was his. He sold it. To pay for flowers I hadn't picked, music I hadn't chosen, and a service I thought I had arranged. Daniel saw the change in my face. "He insisted," he said gently. "Told me you tried to reimburse, said not to let you." Of course he did. That was the thing about my father. He didn't just give, he protected people from the burden of knowing they'd been given to. Even in death he was shielding me. One last gift, one last act of love he never wanted credit for. I sat down. There was a long silence. Finally, I asked, "Why didn't he tell me any of it?" Daniel thought for a moment, then said something I've never forgotten. "Maybe because he didn't want you to carry it. Maybe he believed love works best when it doesn't draw attention to itself. When it just shows up, quietly, like a man fixing a stranger's flat tire at the edge of a snowstorm." He closed the folder gently. "I've been doing this job for almost 20 years, he added, "and I've never seen a man who planned his own funeral so that everyone else could grieve in peace." I left the funeral home that day carrying more than a notebook. I carried the realization that my father had choreographed his exit like he lived his life, carefully, thoughtfully, without fanfare. He hadn't just left this world. He prepared it for his absence. And somehow, in doing so, he'd made room for something else. For me to begin. Blue Book Chapter 9. The Night School. It was the kind of lead you almost don't believe. I was sitting in the back booth of Mabel's Diner, one of the few places in town where the coffee tasted like burnt toast and the waitresses still called you honey whether you were 8 or 80 when I heard it. I was flipping through the notebook again, nursing my second refill, when a voice from the booth behind me said, "You know, your father used to teach here." I turned, startled. The speaker was a man in his 70s, wearing a corduroy blazer with elbow patches and a pair of glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He introduced himself as Mr. Larkin, retired English, 40 years at the high school. His voice had a practiced softness, like someone used to asking difficult students gentle questions. "You're Roy's boy," he said, not asking. I nodded. He gestured to the notebook. "That your father's?" "In a way," I replied. "It's what he left me." Larkin's eyes crinkled. "Then I suppose it's time someone told you about the school." He invited me to his home the next morning, a small white house on Chestnut Lane, surrounded by ivy and half-fallen leaves. Inside, it smelled of pipe tobacco and old library books, the kind of place where time moves slower and silence feels earned. We sat in his den, where books leaned on books and photo frames leaned on those. "He came to me in the fall of '08, Larkin began, settling into his chair. "Said he wanted to help, that he'd heard some of the night students at the community center were falling behind. Young single parents, immigrants, folks trying to get their GEDs, asked if I knew anyone who needed tutoring." He chuckled. I told him we barely had funding for electricity after dark. He said he didn't need to be paid, just needed a whiteboard and some markers. I shook my head. He never mentioned this. Larkin smiled. "He wouldn't have. Your father had a way of offering help like it was your idea all along." He stood and pulled a worn manila folder from the bookshelf. Inside were lesson plans, actual lesson plans in my father's handwriting, labeled by date and subject, basic algebra decimals and fractions. Resume writing, emphasize action verbs. Auto maintenance vocab for ESL students. I stared. "He taught twice a week for nearly 5 years, Larkin said. Math, English, basic life skills. He'd fix someone's car in the lot, then come inside and teach them how to apply for a job. Never once asked for recognition. Barely let us put his name on the attendance sheet." I flipped through the pages. They were full of diagrams, jokes scribbled in the margins, even sample job interview answers with little stars beside them. "He told me once," Larkin added, "that he remembered what it was like to feel stupid, to sit in a room and be afraid to raise your hand. Said no one should carry that feeling forever." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. All my life, I had thought of my father as a man of his hands, grease-stained, silent, practical. Not as a teacher. Not as someone who could patiently explain percentages to a woman working 3 jobs or diagram sentences for a teenager who didn't know the difference between a noun and a need. He didn't wear a cap and gown, but he had been an educator nonetheless. Not for credit, not for applause, just to help people believe in themselves. Before I left, Mr. Larkin handed me something, a photo. It showed my father at a folding table surrounded by a small group of adults, tired eyes, open notebooks, styrofoam coffee cups. He was pointing at something on the page mid-sentence, his face lit by that overhead fluorescent glow. He looked proud, not of himself, of them. "He used to say," Larkin murmured, "that knowledge wasn't a ladder, it was a bridge, and everyone deserves a way across." That night, I pinned the photo to the wall above my desk, next to the notebook, next to the letter, next to the wrench Miguel had given me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel ashamed of who my father had been. I felt honored. Blue Book Chapter 10, The Letters That Found Me. It arrived in the mail 2 weeks after the funeral. A plain white envelope. No return address. My name written in a shaky hand. At first, I thought it was another sympathy card. One of those generic ones with Bible verses pre-printed inside and a signature squeezed into the bottom corner. But when I opened it, something else spilled out. A note, folded twice, and a photograph. The photo showed a boy, maybe 12 years old, holding up a science fair project, a model of the solar system made of styrofoam balls strung on wire. His smile stretched wider than the banner above him, first place. The note was brief. "Dear Tom, you don't know me, but I knew your father. He was the one who bought my first set of textbooks when my mom couldn't. He told me that just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to stay ignorant. He tutored me at his shop after hours, sometimes while he was fixing cars. I wouldn't have graduated high school without him, and I certainly wouldn't be starting my first semester of college this fall. I wanted you to know that your father's belief in me changed my life. Maybe someday I can do the same for someone else. Gratefully, David Morales." I set the note down and stared at the photo again. My father's garage, his grease-stained, tool-littered, fluorescent-lit garage, had doubled as a classroom, a sanctuary, a bridge, just as Mr. Larkin had said. And here was living proof, a boy who now stood taller because my father had stooped lower. The letters didn't stop with David. They trickled in, one after another. From people I had never met, from corners of the town I had rarely set foot in. A woman who said my father used to drop off anonymous bags of groceries when she was between jobs. A man who swore Dad once left a $50 bill under his windshield wiper with only 3 words on the note: "Keep going, friend." A family who said he repaired their furnace one Christmas Eve and refused payment, telling them the only thing he wanted in return was for their children to be warm that night. Each envelope was another piece of him, another window into the world he'd quietly built. I started pinning them on the wall above my desk, right next to the photo from Larkin and the wrench from Miguel. Slowly, the wall turned into a mosaic not of art but of gratitude, a gallery of the unseen. One evening, as I was adding another note to the collection, my neighbor knocked on the door. He was holding a small cardboard box. "Found this in the mail room," he said. "Looks like it's for you." Inside the box was a stack of spiral notebooks. No return label. Just a sticky note on the top, written in the same blocky, all-caps handwriting I knew too well. "For whoever needs them." I flipped the cover of the first one. On the inside page was my father's handwriting again, lesson outlines, diagrams, vocabulary lists like the ones Larkin had shown me. But these weren't for a class, they were for the future. Notes addressed not to a room of students but to anyone who might stumble across them someday. Basic fractions, how to read a paycheck, changing your oil, budgeting on minimum wage. Each page was a survival guide, simple, clear, written with patience. He hadn't just wanted to help the people he knew, he wanted to help the ones he'd never meet, and now they were in my hands. I sat back, staring at the pile of notebooks, the letters, the photographs. A life that looked so small from the outside was suddenly spilling over the edges. And the thought struck me like a hammer against steel. My father had spent his whole life building something. Not a business, not a fortune, not even a reputation. He had built a legacy of usefulness. And somehow, impossibly, it had found its way back to me. Blue Book Chapter 11, The Weight of Regret. The wall in my apartment had become something I hadn't planned for. Letters, photographs, notes in handwriting that wasn't mine but had shaped my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. They spread like ivy across the plaster, climbing, stretching, blooming into a portrait of a man I had misjudged my entire life. And every time I looked at it, I felt 2 things at once: pride and shame. Pride because this was my father. Shame because I never saw him clearly while he was still here. I remembered a moment from when I was 16. I had been at a friend's house, a friend whose father wore pressed shirts and carried a briefcase. Dinner was catered, not cooked. Their living room smelled like leather and pine cleaner, not oil and coffee grounds. When my father came to pick me up, he leaned against his old truck in that same brown jacket he wore every winter. I saw the look on my friend's face, a flicker of pity, maybe embarrassment, and in that instant I felt it too. I climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door harder than I needed to. He asked if I'd had a good time. I muttered, yes, but what I wanted to say was, why can't you be more like him? That thought haunted me now, because while I had been measuring him against other men, he had been measuring himself against something higher. A promise he'd made long before I was born, to never let anyone feel invisible. And he kept that promise quietly, faithfully, while I sat beside him blind. One evening, I pulled his letter out again, the one he'd left for me. I read the line about love not always speaking loud, about how sometimes it just fixes the leaky pipe and never mentions it. I must have read it 100 times, because if that was love, then I had been loved more than I ever knew. The packed lunches. The gas money slipped into my glove compartment when I was broke in college. The way he used to leave the porch light on, no matter how late I came home. Those were his I love yous. I just never learned how to hear them. Regret is a cruel teacher. It makes you replay every moment with new subtitles. The times I brushed him off when he wanted to show me how to rotate my tires. The holidays when I stayed just long enough to eat but left before dessert. The phone calls I let go to voicemail because I was busy. Busy with what? Busy chasing a life I thought would prove something. Meanwhile, he was building a life that already had. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by his notebooks, his photos, his quiet legacy, and I finally said it out loud to no one but myself. I'm sorry, Dad. The words broke something in me, and then softer, I'm proud of you. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the heaviness lift just a little, not gone, maybe it never would be, but lighter, like he had heard me somehow, like forgiveness works both ways. Blue Book Chapter 12. My mother's silence. I hadn't spoken to my mother much since the funeral, not because I didn't want to, but because every time I heard her voice on the phone, grief came rushing in like water through a cracked dam. She sounded older, smaller, as though his absence had pulled the scaffolding out from under her. One Sunday I drove to her house. The same house they'd lived in together since before I was born. The porch light was on, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been waiting. "Hi, Mom. Come in," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. We sat in the living room. She had set out 2 mugs of coffee, though she barely touched hers. On the end table beside her sat his glasses, folded neatly, lenses smudged the way he always left them. For a while we said nothing. Just listened to the old wall clock ticking in the corner. Finally, I asked the question that had been clawing at me since I opened his notebook. "Did you know?" She looked at me, puzzled. "About all of it, the money he gave, the cars he fixed for free, the tutoring, the food." My voice caught. "Did you know what he was doing?" She set her cup down carefully, folded her hands in her lap, and nodded. "Some of it," she admitted. "Not everything. He never told me details, but I knew enough." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, sharper than I meant to. She took a long breath. Her eyes were wet but steady. "Because it wasn't mine to tell. He didn't want recognition. Not from the neighbors, not from the church, not even from his own son. He used to say if people find out, it stops being about them and starts being about me." I leaned back, stunned. "So you just kept quiet all these years?" She gave a sad smile. Tom, marriage is full of things you don't say, secrets, not because they are shameful, but because they are sacred. Your father's giving was like that. It was his way of praying with his hands. She stood and walked into the bedroom. When she returned, she was carrying a small tin box scratched at the corners. She set it between us and opened it. Inside were folded slips of paper, some no bigger than receipts. I picked one up. Roof patch for Ellis family, don't charge. Groceries for Mrs. Carter, she won't ask. Ride for Tony, interview Monday, 9 a.m. Dozens of them, his handwriting again. But these weren't records for himself. They were confessions. He had written them down, then left them in the box like a journal only God was meant to read. I found these after he died, my mother said softly. I think he needed a place to set it down, to keep it somewhere safe, but he never wanted to be thanked. I held one of the slips in my hand and whispered, almost to myself, why didn't he want us to know? Mom reached across and placed her hand over mine. Because, sweetheart, he wanted you to live your life without the weight of his. He didn't want you measuring yourself against him. He just wanted you to be you. Her hand was warm, steady, familiar. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't before. Silence had not been neglect. It had been love, a quieter kind than I was used to, but love nonetheless. That night, as I drove home, I carried the tin box on the seat beside me. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel angry at him for hiding who he was. I felt grateful, because maybe he hadn't hidden it at all. Maybe he'd been showing me all along, just in ways I never knew how to read. Blue Book Chapter 13, a legacy carved in stone. It began quietly, the way most meaningful things do. A neighbor left a note on my porch. We should do something for him, for all of us. Then the church called, asking if they could dedicate a service in his name. Then the mayor's office, the newspaper, even the high school. Word spread like roots under the ground, unseen at first, then unstoppable. Within weeks, the entire town was speaking my father's name again. Not in whispers this time, but in gratitude. One Saturday morning, I stood in the town square. The same square where I used to ride my bike as a kid, weaving between benches, thinking nothing of the people sitting on them. Now those benches were full. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds, gathered with candles in their hands. The air was crisp, the kind of early autumn chill that makes you see your breath. At the center of it all was a stone monument, newly unveiled. It wasn't large. My father wouldn't have wanted large. Just a block of granite with a simple inscription. In memory of Roy Halter, who taught us that the greatest heroes are the quietest ones. Beneath it were the words he'd lived by, the words from his Bible I had found in the drawer. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I felt my throat tighten. One by one, people stepped forward. A man spoke about how my father had driven him to rehab when no one else would. A mother recalled the winter night when her heat went out and he showed up with space heaters and blankets. A teenager said Dad had bought her first graphing calculator, the one she used to pass algebra and later to get into college. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry. I stood there listening and realized that the man I had thought of as ordinary had been anything but. He had been extraordinary in the only way that matters, by showing up again and again for people who needed someone to believe in them. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare a speech. I just stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces, and said, I thought I was burying my father, but it turns out I was uncovering him. You all knew pieces of him I never did. And together you've shown me that his life was bigger than I ever understood. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he left behind something more valuable than either. He left us each other, a community, a family, I paused, swallowed hard, and now it's our turn to carry that forward. The crowd fell silent, then someone lit the first candle, then another. Soon the entire square glowed. For a moment in the flickering light, I could almost see him standing at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, smiling that quiet smile of his. That night, the town voted to start a fund. They called it the Halter Trust. Money pooled not from wealthy donors but from neighbors. $20 here, $10 there. Enough to pay for textbooks, bus fare, groceries, rent for those who found themselves where my father had once been. A legacy not written in stone but in action, exactly the way he would have wanted it. Blue Book Chapter 14, Becoming My Father's Son. For most of my life, I tried not to be like him. I chased the things I thought would make me different: shinier jobs, newer cars, cleaner hands. I wanted a life that looked bigger, louder, more impressive. But standing in that town square, listening to stories of the man I thought I knew, I felt something shift. It wasn't shame anymore. It wasn't just grief. It was resolve. The first step was small, almost laughably small. A neighbor's mailbox leaned crooked on its post. I had walked past it 100 times, shaking my head, waiting for him to fix it. One morning, I grabbed a hammer and nails from my father's garage and set it straight. It wasn't much, 10 minutes of work. But when my neighbor came home that evening and saw it standing tall again, the gratitude in his eyes felt like I had carried a mountain. That was how it began. Soon I found myself keeping a notebook of my own. Not identical to his, no one could replicate that, but similar. Names, dates, small acts, a bag of groceries left on a doorstep, gas money slipped into a friend's wallet, tutoring a teenager from down the street who was failing math. Each entry was a conversation with him. Each act was a way of saying, "I see you now, Dad, I understand." But it wasn't just about what I did. It was about how I thought. I stopped comparing myself to the polished fathers of my childhood friends. I stopped chasing the illusion that worth was measured in promotions, square footage, or the brand stitched on a pair of shoes. My father had been teaching me all along that worth is measured in something else entirely, in usefulness, in kindness, in the quiet courage to care. And once I let that truth settle, I realized I didn't just want to admire him, I wanted to continue him. One evening I sat with my mother on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors too beautiful to describe. "You're starting to look more like him," she said, her voice gentle. "How so?" I asked. "Not in your face," she said, "in your heart." I didn't know what to say. So I just sat with her, watching the light fade, thinking about how sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's a way of being, and that was what he left me. Blue Book Chapter 15, The Fire Spreads Quietly. At first I thought it was just me, that fixing a mailbox, buying groceries for a stranger, or helping a teenager with homework was simply my way of honoring my father. A private vow. But then something unexpected happened. I began to notice others doing it too. One morning, the barista at the coffee shop told me someone had paid for my drink ahead of time. "Happening more often these days," she said with a shrug. "Folks just paying it forward." At the grocery store, I watched a young man carry a heavy cart for an elderly woman out to her car. He set the bags in her trunk, refused her money, and simply said, "Consider it done." At church, I overheard two teenagers talking about how they'd volunteered to rake leaves for widows on the block, because that's what Mr. Halter used to do. I felt my throat tighten at the sound of his name. It was as if his spirit had woven itself into the rhythm of the town. Quiet acts, small sacrifices, Kindnesses that might have gone unnoticed before, now they were multiplying. And every time someone mentioned him, it was not with sadness but with warmth. That's what Roy would have wanted. Do it the Halter way. His life had become a compass. The Halter Trust, the fund the town had started in his name, was already helping families, paying for textbooks, covering rent during layoffs, fixing furnaces in winter. But what struck me most was that it wasn't just the money. It was the spirit. The fund was simply the spark. The fire was the way people began to see each other, to notice. The very thing he had been doing quietly, invisibly for decades, now it was catching. One evening I was walking home when I saw a boy on the sidewalk with a flat bicycle tire. Normally, I might have walked past, telling myself I was late or tired. Instead, I stopped, kneeled down, showed him how to patch it with the kit I still carried in my bag, the one from my father's garage. When I finished, the boy looked up at me and said, "Thanks, mister, you didn't have to." I smiled. That's the point. He didn't understand then, but someday he would. That night, writing the boy's name in my own notebook, I realized something. My father's greatest act was not the hundreds of small things he did in secret. It was planting a way of life in others so that long after he was gone, the kindness would keep multiplying, like seeds carried by the wind. And I, finally, was one of those seeds. Blue Book Chapter 16, The Hidden Hero. A year had passed. The seasons had turned their circle. The leaves that once fell at his funeral had grown back, green and alive again, only to scatter once more across the same sidewalks he used to sweep. And yet, even in his absence, my father was everywhere. I saw him in the light of a repaired street lamp, where children gathered safely at night. I saw him in the notebook pages of a student holding her first college acceptance letter. I saw him in the smile of a stranger who held the door open, in the quiet hand that slipped a few bills into a collection jar when no one was looking. Everywhere I turned, I met pieces of him, not in statues or speeches, but in the living actions of ordinary people who had learned from him that the smallest kindness could carry the heaviest weight. Standing by his grave on the anniversary of his passing, I rested my hand on the cool stone and whispered, "You didn't just leave me a legacy. You left me a map, and I'll keep walking it, Dad, step by quiet step." The wind carried the words away, but I like to think he heard them. Maybe that's what love really is, not a monument, but a momentum, a force that doesn't end when a heartbeat stops, a rhythm that keeps moving, keeps echoing through the lives it has touched. And so, I tell you this story not just to honor him, but to remind us all. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear work boots. They don't always speak loudly. Sometimes they barely speak at all. They don't always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes they sit quietly in a garage, fixing what's broken both in engines and in people. My father was one of those heroes, and if you look closely, maybe you'll find that you've known one too. Thank you for walking with me through this journey, through these chapters of love, regret, and redemption. If this story has touched you, I invite you to reflect on the hidden heroes in your own life, the ones who gave without asking, who loved without applause. Please take care of yourselves, treasure your families, and may your homes be filled with health, peace, and happiness. Until next time, thank you for listening.